Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter day.
Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Dr. Cheryl Lousley from Lakehead University. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks, Steve.
Uh, as most of you know, when you're watching this show, we're taping this in February of 2021. We're still in the midst of the pandemic, and it's affecting many things, including the quality of our taping and our show, which we apologize. And I certainly can't wait to get back into the studio to have the folks from Shaw there to help out on the technical pieces. So, Cheryl, uh, I heard you do a little interview on the radio a little while ago, and I got so interested. Before we get into the kind of the topics of your research, tell us a little bit about your background. You're at Lakehead. You're down in Aurelia at the kind of the newer campus from Lakehead. You know, most of our viewers are here in the Northwest Ontario. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up at Lakehead.
Great question. So I started at Lakehead in 2011. So I know it probably seems like the Lakehead Aurelia campus is the new kid on the block, but it has been around for more than 10 years now. So we have a really active campus, and really there's a lot of connections between the Thunder Bay campus and the Aurelia campus. At the faculty level, obviously our departments cross the campuses, and so I know and work with many of my colleagues at Thunder Bay, but also our students actually. I've had a number of different students who have done their first degree at the Aurelia campus and then moved to Thunder Bay to do a second degree at Lakehead at the Thunder Bay campus. So just to say, we're not that far away. We are very well connected within the university. So my path to Lakehead, maybe the two things that would help people know where I'm coming from. On the sort of academic side, so I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. And my PhD is actually from York University in environmental studies. And you know, that's essentially the research that I'll be talking with you about today. So that makes, you know, it makes sense to people, but it's important to know that not all research gets organized in an interdisciplinary way. And this allows me to bring connections from a lot of different fields. And so my path to Lakehead was through a number of different places. So immediately before coming to Aurelia, I was actually in Munich for a year at a research center there called the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society. And Rachel Carson is often recognized as the woman and scientist who started the contemporary environmental movement for her work on DDT and how what seemed to be this miracle pesticide for use in agriculture didn't somehow just stop in the bodies of insects, but was traveling into our waterways, into the soil, taken up by birds. And so her book, Silent Spring, is often remembered for talking about the sort of silence, you know, the metaphor of the silence of the birds, but also quite crucially, her point was taken up into our bodies too. There is no, you know, clear-cut line and division and boundary between our bodies and where we live and the ecologies that we live in. So interdisciplinary research center, and then I came to Lakehead. But on the personal side, I grew up in Eastern Ontario on a farm, and I think what's perhaps interesting when people think about how do people end up in the university is that I had not thought that that was, you know, the universities were far from where I lived. And it wasn't anything that I was really aware of. I arrived at my undergraduate university, which was McMaster, excited about ideas. And I think that is the best thing for students to come with. And I wouldn't have said that I was interested in the environment. So despite growing up on a farm, working with animals every day, having the back fields and back creeks to wander in, that didn't seem to me to be what was being talked about as the environment. which got singled down to things like recycling and so on. And so it really was at university that I started to appreciate the political side of the environment. And it's also its cultural side, which is very much what I work on, that it's about how we live and how we think and talk about how we live together.
We've got some similarities. I grew up on a little farm too, and just loved hanging out, down by the creek. And yeah, so your work, it kind of connects environmental studies with a number of other issues in our society. Like you mentioned, politics. On your website, there's kind of the effects on workers and on our bodies. So you've been looking at this from a number of, different angles. You have a current project now. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so environmental studies is a huge field. People often think this is about science. I primarily work actually on literature and other kinds of cultural stories and how we talk about things. So sometimes I'm working on fiction and poetry. But this project that I've been working on for some time and that I was talking about on CBC Radio is a set of stories and speeches that were given at public hearings in the process that created sustainable development. So, I mean, everyone has heard of sustainability, right? It's one of those buzz phrases. Every city, every institution thinks that it has to be on board with sustainability. And what this project is kind of taking us back to not just where it came from, but who was involved in creating this idea and the directions that it took. And what actually were some of the voices and the people who spoke who've now been forgotten as part of those voices actually creating sustainable development. And so to do that, what I'm looking at is a set of archives that has the transcripts. So someone has gone there and listened with their earphones to the speeches that people gave and typed them all out. And I'm now reading those transcripts and listening to, vicariously through the decades, through what's there on the page before me, listening to what was said that I think is somewhat different from how sustainability gets talked about now.
So what's the time frame we're looking at, and is this like international? Is this the United Nations, or who what are the transcripts from?
Okay, yes, so this is international, although one of the reasons that I'm working on it has a lot of Canadian material in it. So we're looking at the 1980s, and this is a set of hearings that took place for many years. So across the 80s, it was a commission at the international level mandated by the United Nations. It was called the World Commission on Environment and Development. And it's also known as the Brundtland Commission, named after its chair, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Prime Minister of Norway. And it's often also remembered for the report that it produced, known as the Brundtland Report, again after her. Name is actually Our Common Future. And so you can have a sense, right, that this is a report that was talking about looking forward, right? And sustainability is often associated with the future. How are we going to organize ourselves to live in better ways? And in that report, it offered a definition and a vision of sustainable development. And that's really becomes the beginning of the popularization of sustainable development and how it becomes a policy paradigm that gets taken up internationally, but also, as we've said, right, within cities, within companies, within universities, and so on. But working back, 1983, when the United Nations suggests that a commission should be formed on environment and development, there's a few significant things going on right then. First of all, environment and development at that moment are seen as different, disconnected. There's many notions of development, but there's two that were significant at the time. One is the idea of economic development, that if we're going to have prosperity, we need to have economic development. We often think about development as new things, new infrastructure, and so on. And of course, at that point in time, already a recognition that many of the ways in which economic development happened was having significant ecological impacts. One side of things. So bringing environment and development together, could they be reconciled? The other side, though, is the question of development as developing the infrastructure for well-being and quality of life. And so especially the significant international inequalities between what we now think of as the global north and the countries of the global south. And at that moment of time, it's very much actually a three worlds period. This is the Cold War. And so there's a sense, a very strong sense, still as the UN mandates this commission and as it undertakes its work, that there is a first world, a second world, which is the communist bloc, and the third world. And the third world has sometimes been taken to be seen as kind of a paternalistic language, right? Third or lower or lesser. But this idea of a third world is also an emancipatory language. It was embraced in the 50s and 60s by leaders across the global south as a new kind of solidarity. We're not the first world, we're not the second world, we're a third world. In the moment of decolonization, this moment when countries are winning their independence from the former colonial powers, the notion, right, of a new way of organizing a nation for its citizens, not having to follow one of these other paths, was very prominent. So the commission brings environment also into that conversation. So it's significantly concerned with questions of poverty and questions of international justice and international political economy, which is the trade regimes that and debt that really actually shape and often constrain what different countries can do and what different communities can do, that we're implicated, right, in these things that are sometimes going on at quite a high level economically. And it mattered to put environment into all of those conversations. And the fact that now actually we tend to take that for granted is part of the success of this commission and how they talked about sustainable development.
Wow, there's a lot to that. Like, you know, my mind's just spinning because I'm kind of going, well, okay, so were the leaders, I mean, I don't even know who was really all involved in this, if it was leaders or who, but were there really different perceptions coming from the first world, which is where we are in Canada, right? Or we think we're on top of the whole heap, you know, with the third world? Like, did people see development in a different way? Or I mean, you mentioned the focus on poverty. You know, on one level, we kind of go, yeah, we've dealt with poverty. Well, except for those folks that are in poverty that don't have a voice. But on that international level, what did you see happening there?
Okay, great question. And also, you know, asking how did we position ourselves within that, and was there a certain kind of arrogance? It speaks actually very well to what's going on in the commission. So first thing to know is that actually, yes, there were very different visions of development. There were very heated debates among the commissioners. There were 22 commissioners. And for the first time, it was a majority third world commission. So so it does matter to think about, this is a democratizing of notions of international environmental policy. Okay, so it's a big shift from how environment had been approached at the international level before then. Okay, so it was a democratizing effort here, and there was significant participation from the Warsaw Pact countries, from the third world. So it was actually trying to be fairly representative. People, some were diplomats, academics, union leaders. So it was actually a kind of a broad spectrum, most involved in politics in some sense, because there was a recognition that if we're just about the scientists talking to each other, it's not sufficient to grapple with, why is the status quo the way it is, and how are we going to change that? That's politics. So these are people involved in politics. Now, Canadians were disproportionately involved in this commission. Canada is the only country to have had 2 people at the commission. Maurice Strong was one of the commissioners. He goes on to chair the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. But the Secretary General was Jim McNeill, a Canadian economist, and he's actually the one who kind of runs the show. So he's a really big figure behind the scenes. And so what this means is the commission does its work over a course of 4 years. And when they meet each time in a different country. And in each country, they hold meetings and they hold public hearings. And for me, this is what I'm focused on, is the public hearings. And there's actually a different number of reasons why they're holding public hearings. Part of this is to gain support, make connections to what's going on. They don't want the report to sit on the shelf and gather dust, right? Like, how are we going to make sure that doesn't happen as it previously happened? Let's, each time we go somewhere, we get a chance to hear from the public. They'll be interested in what we're doing. They'll give us their recommendations, and they'll already be interested to know, what are we going to say? It actually was contentious, though. Some of the countries that hosted them did not want public hearings, because it's a chance for the public to come and put the dirty laundry on display, right? Mm-hmm. And this is often what happened. People came and they're saying, we want the world to do this, but also we want the world to do this because Canada is not doing this. Brazil is not doing this, right? And so there's this kind of, the world gets to watch as citizens hold these countries to account. Jim McNeill, being Canadian, means that the commission spends 2 weeks in Canada. They only spend a few days in the other countries that they go to. There's only 8 countries, but they spend 2 weeks in Canada. And very much there had been a sense of arrogance at times. There's statements of some of the commissioners saying things like, in other contexts, for example, at the hearings in Brazil, you, as in the developing world or those living in poverty, might be experiencing this now, but we've solved this. So we're your future. But the people participating had different ideas about the future, what their futures were going to be, and also about what sustainability and sustainable development meant, and the environment. And so 2 things that I'd really like to foreground from my research, and when the commissioners come to Canada, 2 weeks, they hold the public hearings at the end of the 2 weeks. As they travel across the country, Indigenous peoples are pretty much not in the room, not in the schedule. Public hearings open in 1986, May 1986, in Ottawa, and a large number of the people speaking at that public hearing are Indigenous. You have all the major Indigenous organizations in Canada there and speaking and making written submissions. So obviously Assembly of First Nations, but also Inuit Tapirset of Canada, Native Council of of Canada, which represented non-status and Métis at the time, and a number of other organizations representing Indigenous groups in Canada. So all of a sudden, the hearings matter for this place where Indigenous people can speak. And did they ever speak and hold Canada to account? Before I tell you a little bit about what was said, let me backtrack. There the commission is, crossing the country, hosted by Canadian officials, right? Canada puts the agenda together. Who should you talk to? Where should you go? And the second day that they're in Canada, they go to Alberta. They spend an entire day in the Athabasca oil sands. And they tour Syncrude's Mildred Lake mine site. They have a luncheon courtesy of the Alberta government. And then they tour the newly opened Oil Sands Interpretive Center in Fort McMurray. This is part of the backroom meetings of the commission. Those who read their report, Our Common Future, would have no idea that the commission went to the oil sands, met with Syncrude, spent all this time with the Alberta government at that moment. What you would see, though, in reading the report are actually some of the testimonies given by Indigenous people in Canada. Several of them are quoted because the report emphasizes that it heard from ordinary people. And it has 80 quotations in sort of big text box all through the report, every second or third page. And so I'm working on the tension between this. So when they present sustainable development and their recommendations, they say, look, we heard from the people of the world, and look at their different voices. They're coming from very different places, different experiences. They all came together through the commission in these hearings and spoke to us. And by speaking to us, in some sense, they said, we'd like to see another world. We'd like to see change. We want to see something different. So these voices become part of an endorsement of sustainable development and what the commission recommends. On the other hand, the commission heard as much, right, from industry and from governments who are very closely tied to industry. And they don't foreground that explicitly as saying this shaped our agenda, okay? So that's one of the things why I think it's really useful to work on archives and pull out, right, the tensions that were embedded, the differences of agreement, but also differences of power, right? And the opportunity to be heard and for that to be transparent to the public who really shaped this. So one last thing about that tour of the oil sands. So the reason they go is because the Canadian government was showcasing the oil sands as what sustainable development was going to look like in Canada. They were touting all the benefits, all the anticipatory, they were anticipating, you know, there could be the tailing ponds might poison migrating birds as they travel through this important boreal forest, but we're going to do a great job to deal with this. All the things that have since happened and now make the oil sands a deep concern environmentally, especially on climate change. They said, oh, but we got this figured out. We're going to address it. 25 years later is when that Mildred Lake mine site becomes the single largest greenhouse gas emitter in Canada, which it still is today. So when you said, you know, do we think we're pretty, you know, arrogant and we know what we're doing? There's my example. The oil sands were the showcase of what Canadian sustainable development was going to look like, and they were right. That is what came to be, right? That is what came to be. But there were other visions, and those were articulated by those speaking at the hearings. And this is what my work is involved in, is saying it still matters to hear and listen to those other voices and to recognize that other people were making a claim on sustainable development. We shouldn't write it off as being all about slick talk by industry, right? It was a dream. It was a possibility. It was a vision that really was about justice and poverty. And many people could see themselves in that dream and thought it was worth participating in this democratic process. And I know we don't have that much more time left, but some of those people, when the commission came to Canada, were certainly Indigenous groups. And again, they were very prescient. They could see immediately why Indigenous people would be at the heart of sustainable development, because Indigenous lands and Indigenous peoples are those who bear the brunt of significant development, economic development policies that are disregarding the environment. They could see that, they could name it, and they did.
Cheryl, there's just so much more I want to know, but we're out of time. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Thank you so much for coming and sharing what you've got. Like, are people going to be able to access more information, like on your website or something? What's the best way for people to follow up?
Okay, so there's two things. Certainly, if people are interested and want to talk to me, you can find out more about me and my projects and all my contact information at the Lakehead University website. But really, to kind of hear these voices and stories and so on, I'm working on a book manuscript that is close to completion. And that's why, as academics, we, sometimes we spend long periods of time at our desks writing, but it's to be able to make the knowledge that we've gathered and these stories that we're able to hear, make them available to others. So there will be a book, and that's really the way that people are going to be able to hear more and learn more about what's going on.
Well, definitely let me know when that book comes out, and we'll promote it on the show. Once again, thank you so much for coming on. And I want to say to all our viewers, please stay safe and share your voice. You may not know that anyone's listening, but people like Cheryl, maybe decades later, will be looking at it. So stand up and share your truth. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter day.